on the show, the new sort of iteration that's I call pain talking. So that's what we're going to talk about. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Rich. How are you?
Yeah, no, good. Good to see you. We've been chatting a lot since, well, we always chat, but in particular since an excellent day that we had in Bournemouth, kind of reviewing things all around pain. And I thought it'd be great to have a chat about where we are on that, or where we think we are, and on that, and explore some of the sort of newer things that have come out and the flavors of that, and sort of try and tie it all together, really, just to give people a general sense of what's what in the world of pain.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic opportunity. I think we've been having our private conversations, and I think we both felt that it was worth sharing one or two of them. Just our opinion, as always, but hopefully based on the work that you do and the work that I do, and giving our perspective on some of the newer ideas, and particularly newer therapies and therapeutic approaches
Yeah.
emerging.
Yeah, no, no, definitely, definitely. Now, what may be useful, I think, because not everyone's going to be familiar with where we're at. Some will be, but I think it might be useful just to sort of backtrack a little and give the kind of the classic bio, because I love hearing about your career and the people you work with, and you sort of took some unusual steps along the way. So just if you could just sort of, I just love hearing it. So just tell me that story again.
Well, I trained to be a physio, first and foremost. Was very lucky there to meet Professor Tim Watson, who most people know in association with things like tissue healing and electrotherapy. And Tim was one of those people who understood the subject so well that he understood why you might not do it in clinical practice as readily as other people. That's certainly a take from his stance on electrotherapy. But his real academic background, was in tissue healing and tissue batteries, which have become very topical these days with the work of people like Michael Levin, who obviously has taken it in an whole different direction, but there's a lot of overlaps there. So I did a lot of work with Tim. He'd set me additional work rather than just doing my basic sort of undergrad training. We'd look at a couple of novel ideas together. I was always interested in pain. I'd done some experiments in pain for my Nuffield A-level biology project, one in woodlouse and one in dragonflies, both of which are insects that I still love to this day, and I've been involved in doing some studies in. But anyway, trained to be a physio, then trained to be a manual therapist, did the MACP, which was at that time the long extended diploma course before it became a master's course. Got heaps from that, was supposed to be able to do that reasonably well, did well in my exams. But when I looked in the clinic to my patients, there were a small population of those patients who really didn't benefit at all from that hands-on approach. And that rekindled my interest in pain, and that's what I really identified and worked hard to identify was the core issue with those people. They had ongoing pain experiences. So made me ask lots of questions. I always wanted to be an academic, so the natural progression for me was to do an MSc, which I did at UCL with a massive pain neuroscience component, worked with some of the greats of the world like Clifford Wolf, Bruce Lynn, etc. There, lectured by Pat and Steve McMahon as well, who feature um, throughout a number of years in my development. So I did a PhD with those guys and Steve Thompson. Um, so we're in a pretty exciting lab, cutting edge, doing some work. My own work was in chemokines, so chemoattractive cytokines and neuropathic pain. We were one of the first groups doing that sort of work. I remember my first IAFS conference looking at the immune system and pain, and there was probably 10 people in there, very, very eminent people: George DeLeo, Linda Watkins, Linda Sorkin, Claudia Sommer, Mark Hutchinson, who's since done a lot of work that's influenced a lot of physios. So yeah, there was a sort of feeling that we were a bit wacky and looking at sort of slightly odd sort of field in quite an odd place at odd cells, a system that hadn't traditionally been thought of as involved in pain. But yeah, it's interesting to note that just recently there's been a number of special editions of various journals looking at the neuroimmune system in pain. So it's obviously 20 odd years later, a very rich field that's been mined by many. So I worked in that area, still had lots of questions about pain. So I was lucky enough then to do a postdoc, be heavily involved in the neuroimaging work that was being done at the Institute of Psychiatry. So all this was at King's College, where I was also lecturing, which is where we met as an undergrad. And I established a master's degree, which you very kindly signed up and did and contributed massively to, as all the students who did that program were expected to. You know, it wasn't a one-way didactic approach. I hope you'd agree with that. We were sharing ideas and your own background, and that of all the other students on the course was really quite special. You know, it's truly a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary MSc called Pain, Science and Society, intentionally to get it away from just the biology. So still had loads of questions. You know, I'd done all this work in the brain, looking for sort of so-called biomarkers, taken some of the work I'd done in the immune system in the sort of dorsal horn and periphery up into the sort of brain. Some interesting findings. It led to lots of questions that were unanswered. So I more and more developed my interest that was already there in philosophy, and went to talk to some of the most eminent philosophers in the field of consciousness and cognition that were available to me, both at King's College and outside. So people like David Papineau, Tim Bain, Nick O'Shea, David Bain, and they sort of persuaded me that the guy I really needed to talk to was Andy Clark. And Andy had sort of published a very eminent paper on predictive processing. I'd already been sort of aware of things like Carl Friston's free energy principle. And so I went to talk to Andy, and we formed a collaboration. So I worked with Andy Clark, who obviously a very eminent philosopher, but also cognitive neuroscience. I don't think he gets enough credit for his deep intellect in the world of neuroscience. And we really tried to unravel pain from that perspective. I think we would say we agreed sort of 95% of the time, and maybe slightly disagreed in sort of 5%, which I think is relevant to this discussion. It's very healthy disagreement. You know, someone I hugely respect, and I can't think of a nicer human being that I've ever met, as in company included. So, or accepted, or whatever the right word is. You know, you're a decent bloke too. And actually, all the people I've worked with have been hugely decent human beings. Much more interesting than just the sort of topics they're well known for. But I suppose, I went there with this perspective that I knew my neuroscience, my neurobiology. I'd done a lot of experiments. I could use that as a frame of reference to test these ideas about predictive processing. And very much because of that sort of history I've given, wanted to move away from just to focus on the brain. I'd written well before that on the fact that I felt that the old world of pain was becoming very brain-centric. You know, we'd replace the sort of periphery, then the dorsal horn with the brain, and that became the hot topic. You know, largely influenced by people like Ron Melzack's neuromatrix idea, and particularly in physio, good mates of mine, Lorimer Mosley and Louis Gifford and Dave Butler, had sort of promoted a fairly brain-centric, neurocentric viewpoint. Obviously, my PhD was drifting away from a purely neurocentric point of view. It wasn't to say the nervous system's not important, but it was very much about showing other systems that I now refer to as a super system were involved, and that included things like your endocrine system as well. And that work led me to sort of work alongside one of another of the Edinburgh group of sort of Andy and extended people, Julian Kiverstein, who been hugely influential on my thinking and maturing my thinking from a philosophical point of view. And we wrote this paper together with Michael Kirkhope called The Embodied Predictive Processing Model of Pain. But that really posited that we need to see pain as an inference, that is an inference gained across all of the bodily systems. So not just the neuroendocrine immune system, but other systems as well. But it's very much saying, that this is not just a brain thing. It's not just a nervous system thing. So that probably takes us to where we are now. And you mentioned Bournemouth, that was part of the announcement, and that was the first meeting with external people of the pain and active inference group, part of the Health Sciences University, where I'm lucky enough to be a visiting professor, and I hold a professorship at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and also work for a software company called EQL, where we develop triage and other types of software that have AI level functionality, but actually aren't AIs. And this is something we're really interested in, and they're driven by Bayesian engines, which actually is how I got into that work, because Bayes is fundamentally the underpinning of predictive processing, active inference, etc. So as you're saying, more recently we're looking not only at pain but some other conditions from a similar point of view. As part of that group in HSU and elsewhere. So I think that's enough. If unless you want me to go into more detail.
Well, I think what that does is it just frames really nicely, where we're going to go with the bulk of this conversation, because I think it's important for people to understand that journey that you've taken, and things like, because you still see people writing and talking about, and I know they mean well, that the immune system's involved with pain, as if it's a new idea, and this isn't a criticism at all. It's just saying, look, these ideas, and people have been working on this for quite some time, that we can build on. And actually, it's great that people are thinking more widely to understand that it is more, it's far more than about where it hurts in the body, although that's important as well. But it's about all of these systems. And I love that. I mean, I must admit, I've been, since hearing you talk about the super system, I've been using that phrase and saying that it's come from you, of course, because it kind of makes sense. It makes sense to call it that. So I'm just curious. There was something you said when you kind of went into the philosophical move around and predictive processing. I just wondered sort of how that kind of happened, because I mean that was a massive move.
Yeah, I think I've probably skirted over some of those other people, the conversations that led me to eventually Andy Clark. They were really informative to me. So I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time with David Papineau, who was a professor at King's, probably someone who I would fundamentally disagree on a lot of aspects of sort of sensory processing and understanding of perception and experiences. But I would now, but at the time, he was shaping my thinking and asking questions in the way that philosophers do, and that was part of a really good training. And people like Nick Shea, who'd come to King's, who was also, very, very meticulous human being in every way, had a strong mathematical sort of understanding, and would frame things in very technical language and interrogate you in a very philosophically deep way. And we did a very nice sort of one-day conference where people like David Knott also presented, and that was really not only an informative day, but a very interesting and important day for me to sort of be part of this sort of navigating a journey and a direction of travel into philosophy. And that not only encouraged me, but emboldened me to talk to other people, people like Tim Bain, who was recognized as one of the leading figures in consciousness, and went up to Oxford and spent a lovely day with Tim in a coffee shop, drinking copious amounts of coffee, and Tim asking really quite complex questions, particularly for me at the time. Is pain cognitively penetrable? Something I'd not really considered or been asked to consider. And that led to looking at people like Fiona McPherson's work, who was up at Glasgow, and that led to an understanding those guys were doing, there's a pain group there, Michael Bradley, David Bain, as I say, spelled differently, to Tim Bain's spelling of his surname. If people want to look, one's Bain, and one is Bayne. So Tim is Bayne, and David is Bain. And they were doing some lovely stuff, again, and looking at pain from a philosophical point of view in a way that I don't share a huge amount of empathy for, because my area of philosophy that I became interested in, developed, part of working with Andy and Julian, was more phenomenological, was more sort of away from analytical philosophy that those guys were more involved in, but a much more sort of practically applied philosophy, if I'm allowed to say that. So it wasn't that was probably a journey that took 6-7 years to complete. It wasn't quick. It was hugely demanding.
Yeah. So that was in that period. What kind of what era are we in now? What were the sort of the rough years of that?
So that would have started really about 2009 and taken me up. Taken me up to today, but 2016 when I started working with Andy.
Yeah. So would it be fair to say then that, and you may not be comfortable with me saying this, would it be fair to say that really it's the work that you've done there that's brought PP and pain together in the way that we're thinking about it now?
Yeah, I think certainly when I delved into that literature deeply, there wasn't an awful lot of focus on pain. I'm not sure I can take entire credit for it. I think other people were beginning to think like that. But to formalize it and to do it with, if you like, to do that interrogation and try to formalize it with the right people, i.e., those people really on the cutting edge of proposing it as an idea and testing it in if you like, against empirical evidence, etc. I think, it was certainly at the vanguard, if that's the right word for that. But again, do you claim ownership, or it's ridiculous to do so? There'd been much discussion in the philosophy world around pain, and different schools of thought holding on to different viewpoints. So I mentioned David, Papineau, he strongly held on to a belief, certainly in all the time we were communicating, that seed fibers were, as nociceptors, were a good surrogate for understanding pain. Obviously, that was difficult for me from a neuroscience point of view to really engage with in a deeper way. But the conversation that emerged from that disagreement is really, I owe David a lot, because he was the first person who trained me in any sense to become a philosopher.
Yeah. I get a real sense of that, because I started, I can't remember what it was now. There were these sort of small meetings. There was Anil Seth, there was Andy Clark, there was Thomas Metzi. There was all these people sort of gathering in small groups. I remember the first one was in Oxford, and others, Anna Tunica, and these people doing all this really interesting work, Mark Miller, these sort of things. And I used to go along, and I must admit I didn't have the confidence to ask any questions, but I loved listening to the kinds of questions people asked to each other, but also the level of respect, because obviously you had these big names in that world, but the way they asked the postdocs and the presenters questions was so respectful and humble and kind of open to the answers. I mean, just like you said with the masters at King's, that yes, I mean, we learned immense amounts from you, but equally you were open to learning from us. And that's a big learning that I've had from that kind of world, which we don't see too often. It gets too much sort of like this, rather than, okay, I disagree with you. It's nothing personal. I just, let's talk about it and work it through, just like you described there. And then that shapes all of us in a better way, surely.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely that. That I've sort of fairly active life in my younger days in sport, and many of the sports I played, particularly rugby union, were very confrontational, and that was something that I hugely enjoyed, that confrontation on a pitch. But I always felt academically it wasn't the way to really go. Yeah, be vigorous with each other, but be hugely respectful. My friendship with Louis Gifford is well recorded from his wife Philippa Tyndall's account of me challenging vigorously at a conference, and then them inviting me to converse with them and correspond with them, and as becoming huge friends who hugely influenced each other's thinking. And we respectfully disagreed on lots of things. That was very much the atmosphere of all those really when I say impressive, that's not to big up my CV, but impressive institutions and labs and departments that I was lucky enough to work with. And I said lots of times the only thing that I could bring to the table was I didn't mind looking stupid in front of clever people, but I also brought some clinical knowledge and clinical background and real world background of treating patients and failing to make an impact on lots of people was probably the thing I bought most. Um, and not understanding that, but trying to find out why not. And I think that that's something that I'm not sure everyone would agree that I've always got it right, but I've tried to sort of always correspond and talk to people at that level. But you're right, talking to philosophers, they're very used to being questioned, is what they do, and to look at the question and break down the question and break down someone else's argument. And in doing so, you learn to respect someone's argument. You've got to know someone's position really well before you can disagree with it. And I think if you don't know it well enough, you've got to be very judicious and cautious about doing that. You know, I might even say it probably partially negates your right to do it if you don't give enough time and invest enough interest in someone else's perspective. And I like to think I've done that. I think I'm on record as saying, I'd never like to be under-read. Read 2 hours a day for the entirety of my career, including as a student, pretty broadly, but also very intensely about some of these topics. And I got to say, the philosophy reading that I did for a number of years was amongst the most challenging, perhaps only out challenged by a deep interest in Zen Buddhism, which obviously is in one sense a philosophy anyway. So that's really challenging literature as well. But I think, just learning how to question, learning to position against someone else's position. I'm still nowhere near as adept at it as some people. Again, I think recently I've been on record as restating the fact that I think I'm largely inarticulate, which is probably why this call will go on for longer than it perhaps should. But forgive me, and your listeners forgive me. But it's a constant learning, and it's a constant being interested in the propositions people make and trying to formulate your own position against that. Change your position where necessary. That's certainly happened in me. I was very motivated by learning the neurophysiology of pain. I'm glad I did that. I still do that. I'm interested in the molecular side of things. But could it answer the questions about pain I felt were important for the clinic? No, I am bold enough to say that, and I would stick by that. It doesn't answer the important questions that people who are experiencing ongoing pain ask and need answering. And that's what took me on this search to other domains and other specialities and other parallel subjects. But in a way, I'm struggling with words, not because I'm being inarticulate, but more because that traditional siloing of ideas and thought and not being more inclusive of other perspectives and scientific fields when you're developing an idea is something I feel does a lot of damage when we try to understand a topic that applies to so many people in terms of things like persistent pain.
Yeah. Well, we've talked before about, I mean, I would never say anything like you have an issue with articulating. It's what you do though is explain things with the language that's necessary, I would say. So in other words, if it's a philosophical domain, you'll use that language. If it's a neuroscience domain, you use that language. Or if it's a blend, you'll use a blend of those languages, which of course doesn't necessarily suit the listener if they're not prepared to learn that language or become accustomed to it. They want it to be simplified. But the risk there, as we've said before, is losing something by simplifying it. I know you feel strongly about that.
Yeah, I do. I think, look, these things have got to be accessible for people. I completely agree with that. But also there has to come with a certain amount of discipline. I think I'm quoted in Actually Explain Pain, that when a topic is really quite complex, which I think pain is, how do you not use some degree of complexity of language and have to really investigate and interrogate really complex ideas that are proposed for that? And one of the things that I think, there's a lot of metaphor in the pain world, and go back to things like Lakoff's book, and 50% of it is promoting the use of metaphors. Metaphors we live by is what I'm referring to, but 50% of the book is warning about the danger of metaphor, and that's what concerns me. And I think we're probably going to investigate some of the more dominated metaphors, or in fact, we could even describe them as fallacies that or bandied about when we talk about a topic like pain. So I think it's about being having a discipline to try and learn a lot. I'm obviously involved in this digital world, and there's quite a novel idea called, the sort of idea of a digital mindset, where you need to understand at least 30% of someone's field across the digital framework, to be able to truly converse with them and be able to interrogate or get something from. Now, I hope I've gone beyond 30% in several of the fields we've mentioned, but I think that's really quite a good sort of way of looking at it. How much do you understand of someone else's perspective? But one of the most easy ways to extract quality information that's really able to impact you and make a change to your thinking is to be able to talk their language. It's just the same as going to France and talking to people in French, or at least making an effort to, and saying, with other languages. But in terms of going to philosophers, it was important to gain some of their language. It's technically difficult. You've identified that yourself. But after a while, if you don't put pressure on yourself, you imbibe that. Just as philosophers find it really difficult to understand terms like long-term potentiation, or physiological frameworks. So I think, it's been something that I've worked really hard, and to a degree, it's compensated against some of my inarticulate, nature. That actually I've worked hard to learn the language so that I can use that language to communicate. But one thing that's interesting, and to make you smile, I hope, Rich, is that no one has really listened to me talk to patients apart from patients, and I don't use that florid technical language. Someone recently called it as jargon. I mean, the assumption is when you're talking to a learned audience, of academics and clinicians, that you're going to use the same language when you're with a patient, who are equally as intelligent and equally as challenging as any philosopher or anyone else I've met. But they have a different language often, not always, but often. And so again, make every effort to learn that language and to talk that language. And that's where my working class background of sort of partially growing up in the countryside in Lincolnshire, where there's some very strange words for things that the rest of the country don't use. Yeah, you talk that language, so things like strewn for a pain that's something between an ache and a more severe pain, would be a word that I would identify. I haven't heard it too often where I live down in Surrey, but it's a word that if someone used with me, or any word, I would include that in my communication with them. It would, and not to do so would be remiss. I mean, just as not using correct language with people from certain disciplines. So I just want to get that across as well. You don't talk to people any different way to what they are talking to you.
Yeah. It was interesting because when I did my first training, as was as a nurse, and there was a lot of emphasis on this. I must admit, at the time when I was getting that training, age 18 or 19, I didn't really know what they were on about. I just sort of went with it. But there was a lot of emphasis on the person and really spending time with them, learning how to shave a man and just really intimate things where you're connecting with another human being. And that was really drilled into us. And as I said, at the time, I didn't appreciate it at all. But as things sort of evolved, and obviously now, just see that as one of the most valuable lessons. And that was always massively echoed by you. So whilst we looked at all sorts of molecular biology and the real sort of heavy science of pain, which is fascinating, it always needed to be relevant. Just as you said, we've got to be able to answer these questions that people have, and you always massively emphasize that, hence the pain, science and society, I think. The questions that you referred to, are there any that sort of come to mind now, the sort of the biggies that have really kind of influenced your exploration?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the one I'm well known for engaging with various characters on social media platform about is whether pain's a sensation or it's a perception. My take is that it's a perception, and their take is strongly held that it's a sensation. But I think that if you go down the path of sensation, of which I've investigated all levels of the near axis and tried to understand deeply, is I cannot find pain contained within that sensory processing sensation perspective. You will always come to Dave Chalmers' idea of the hard problem, an explanatory gap between all this sort of biology, and then what it feels like to be in pain and have the quality of pain. Some people refer to that as well, it's gone completely out of my head, beginning with Q. Rich, help me.
Well, the sensation.
Qualia, sorry.
Qualia.
Yeah. But I think that the difficulty is that we've been brought up on a very biomedical perspective in terms of how we've learned all of that stuff. A lot of people have postulated that there are things that I would say are high construct, like negative hedonic, negative valence contained within that system, the nociceptive system. But when you take a deep dive, if you look at the receptor profiles, the neurotransmitter profiles, they're used both across nociceptive and non-nociceptive systems. So if it was something containing glutamate that makes it negatively valent, why, for example, wouldn't every taste you have be somehow leading to a negatively valenced experience? And thank goodness we don't generally have that. There are a few people, unfortunately, impacted by certain disease states, but they're generally higher level neurological lesions that do unfortunately have aversive sort of, if you like, taste experiences to pretty much everything they put in their mouth. So again, I could go through with all of that system. The other thing is I'm not being persuaded in my career, and I've tried to look at this as deeply as I can, of the idea of coding and then decoding. Where does that occur? Is there something in the code? People like Pat Wall started that off with sort of the pattern theory of pain and investigating that, which was an inherent part of the pain gate theory for people who know anything about some of the theories. But again, we don't have any more information on that really than we did sort of 60, 70 years ago. And there's been some beautiful work, and I'm a huge admirer of people like Steve Prescott's work on coding and decoding. But I'm not persuaded that that gives us any more insights to the overcoming the explanatory gap, or the hard problem of consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, as it properly should be called, in relation to pain. That requires the same system, but operating in conjunction with other systems to essentially come out with a final inference, which is that there's something potentially wrong with oneself in a particular situation you find yourself in. I'm layering all of this with context because it's the only way that I can really understand pain. By or from.
Yeah, well, I mean, I always I don't know where some of these things come from, but I often say, to understand someone's pain, you got to understand them. You got to understand them and their whole life. The whole life story. And so that requires meeting them where they are and having an in-depth and caring conversation where they feel safe to do that, but also to be aware of our own boundaries of what we are capable of holding with someone, because I think that obviously for a few years now there's a whole kind of industry built up around trauma. And I remember a meeting at Reading some years ago. You sort of made the really important point that you can't just assume that this is all down to trauma, because I think that does happen. We have to be very, very careful with that. We've got to listen to the person, because a trauma, something's happened, but it's really about what happened inside that person since. And you have to be very skillful and careful about how you ask about that. And I think there's a bit of a worry worry I have, is that some people are obviously trained to do that and to hold that. And then you've got therapists, for example, and then you've got a bunch of other healthcare professionals who, some may avoid it because they're really scared about going there. And I get that, I understand that. And then you've got others who are kind of trauma informed, but go in far more deeply than they're trained to. And that's a worry as well. So somehow we got to find a way of fitting this together. And I just wonder if, because the PP, the predictive processing, seems to offer this sort of opportunity to start doing that, because you can see the bigger picture.
Yeah, I think it should lead to that. I think, however, I mean, while you were talking, I was thinking of going back to what I said about Tim Watson. When you really understand a topic, when something is relevant or not relevant. And, the people who are highly trained in these areas will hear things that, unfortunately, a lot of people less trained put too much weighting on. They follow that. Whereas someone who's trained will say, okay, that's not a normal experience, but it's part of, traveling through life, and you have these experiences that clearly you remember and have had significant impact on you, but they shouldn't be given too much weighting. And you could say, well, that's a judgment call, but that's where the skill comes in. And I think the problem is with people who are not skilled enough or not trained enough, they often overweight the wrong element of what someone's telling them, or there's a danger of that anyway. So I think, we all, again, same thing as my own journey. I'd invite people who really want to improve their day-to-day clinical practice. They need to find supportive mentors in those other fields who help them navigate those journeys, if that's something they feel they want to navigate or have to navigate against the sort of patients. I ran one of the first sort of pain, specialist back pain services, which was designed around people like Paul Watson's ideas about return to work. Got mixed feelings about that, but it was a very interesting sort of experience. And in that, we had roughly 20% of the people would reveal these really quite nasty, negative early life experiences, which I think is probably about the level that the literature suggests. None of that was invited to come out. It wasn't part of the questioning or the screening we did, and it never came out in the first treatment anyway. It sort of came out in the fourth or fifth session with these people, individuals. I often to this day say the biggest compliment, the proudest thing I've had is the majority, unfortunately, something I know you're looking at a lot at the moment with females, female related pain. Were really nasty experiences, and there they were on a one-to-one, because we were tried to do it where their stories and their voice wasn't overheard in a more open department. It was a closed room, and I had all sorts of thoughts on that based on these stories. But actually, really, what I'm getting across is creating the right therapeutic environment led to people opening up and telling you all the things they felt were important and they needed to. And my response was always, and it still would be, is I am not an expert at dealing with the things you just told me. However, I'm not judgmental about them. I'm not in any way worried that you told me that. If you would like to bring it up in any of our conversations, I would be here as a listener to that, but I am not an expert to deal with that. But we can get you help, and if at any point you feel that would help you move forward with your pain or just generally in life, tell me and we'll put you in touch with the right people. And obviously, that service was supported by a really skilled clinical psychologist team. And that wasn't running away from the problem, I hope. Probably haven't worded it quite how I would have worded it with them, but was the idea was I'm not in any way shocked or surprised. I would hopefully, be empathetic to that, voice that kind of being nice and go into an appropriate level of detail of sort of saying, what I felt about that, but always with that message about, getting help. And I know you yourself, in your work, you work with an awful lot of people who support you in your practice, have helped you to develop your practice, but also are there when you feel your skills, your knowledge have been exceeded. And I think that's really, really important thing for all of us. And also to realize that people who come from the more so-called talking therapies, one of the key elements of their job is that they also have debriefs with other talking therapists. And it's often surprised me that we as physiotherapists or osteopaths or chiropractics or more physically related professions, we don't feel that's necessary. And I think that is something we still need to rectify. We need to do something about that. I once treated a vicar who was in the old Westminster Hospital, which is long since gone. It's now MI5's headquarters, and it was quite an open plan physiotherapy department. In lots of ways terrible, in lots of ways great, but every conversation could be heard really. And he once said to me, Mick, do you ever get any counselling? Because I've sat here and heard things that I would feel difficult to deal with, and I'm trained, part of my pastoral training has been to help people and to talk to this. Do you get any of that? And actually, we've been lucky at West Mid where I trained, because there was a lecturer there who was thought as a bit of an oddball because she was actually totally interested in these areas. And I know lectures were badly attended, as I believe for a number of years those sort of lectures were across all physiotherapy educational sites. But I hope that's changed now. I saw some of that change while I was at King's. But yeah, people came to be physiotherapists because they wanted to be physical therapists, you know?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I've always thought and wondered. I mean, I'm sort of lucky that I suppose I had the leaning to always surround myself with others and have mentors like yourself, and then Mike Pegg's been amazing, and others like you surround yourself with people so that you can talk to, and that they can question you and ask you things, and help you to develop, or even to download, so supervision, mentoring, therapy, why not? I mean, we've all got our stuff, and we're bringing that. If we're not aware, we're bringing that to situations. We all get triggered by situations, by things people say, by things patients say. Things that have happened to them might trigger in us, and it's not, that's not voluntary. That it just happens. It's being human. But if you can't handle it, now your stuff's in the room as well. So, Gabor Mate, I'm not a fan of everything he says, but he says, he's mainly talking about doctors. He says you got the traumatized treating the traumatized, and there's elements of truth in that.
Yeah,
and it's a worry.
Masses, and yeah, I mean, clinicians are humans and patients too, and have life experiences, and and some incredibly negative life experiences. I've known many of my colleagues well enough for very open conversations, and their profile, if you like, looks exactly like the people who they're treating. And I think that's really important to realize. And I think it sounds so wet and PC, but I've got to say, just being kind to each other, and actually being expectant of kindness shown to you by patients, of which I've enjoyed numerous examples of. I I trod a path to try and help more people by educating people, but there's not really a day goes by where I don't miss that sort of interaction with people in the clinic. And some people may be surprised by that. Some people may not believe it. That's fine. But first and foremost, that's what we're here to do. And I suppose there's some things that emerge from that as well, Rich, that we've been talking about recently, where maybe some of those things we've just discussed are taken to a more extreme, and become almost perceived as causative to why people have persistent pain. And I know we've both been reading recently, the sort of literature around several modern approaches to pain management, which is absolutely a respectful and right thing to do, and having some concerns with them, but while supporting, based on this conversation and our background, huge amounts of what they're putting into print and utilizing as part of their thought processes and reasoning processes, are hugely important. But it's how far you go all the time, isn't it? It's how far you go from understanding to promoting when you feel there's a need to promote. But if you're not careful, you can go into proletizing, and that becomes a problem, I think.
And there's some new books that have come out, or fairly recent books and such like, which we'll look at. As you said, we both agree with a lot of the stuff that's said, the basis of those, the predictive processing. But then I think some of my concerns are around anything that's protocol driven, anything that's delivered with absolute certainty. That this is the way, or indeed this is my way. I think we've got to be really careful with that sort of stuff. The reason why I think we've got to be careful is because of, like we were saying before, it's how it lands with people. Someone's picking up that book in their home or wherever they are, as in someone who's experiencing persistent pain, And there's just a zillion reasons why they could, because everyone's got their own unique story, their own unique pain, their own unique body systems. Everything's unique. So you don't know how it's going to land, and that unique moment, they could pick it up and go, do you know what? This is really helpful, and we see testaments to that online. And I would validate those stories. That's great. If someone finds that there's a particular book, whatever it is, it could be the power of now, it could be the unlearn your pain, it could whatever. They can read a book and it can be transformative. I mean, you talked about the Tao of Pooh. I've read that. I love it. It is. It sort of shifts something, and that's great. But equally, what we need to be aware of is what happens if someone reads that book and they don't feel that they're getting better from it and they don't really understand it. And then they think, God, I don't get this either. Look at all these people getting better and I'm not. There must be something really wrong with me now. And I just wonder what we're doing as a collective, and as we're all about the collaboration. What are we doing as a collective bunch of people across the globe, caring for people, like pain care, to look after everyone, not just the ones who get better?
Yeah, and I think that what it drives is a philosophy that deals with all, and realizing that needs, deserves, and requires flexibility in your own thinking and your own standpoint, and not to try and shoehorn these things into your own perspective. The famous quote, all you've got is a hammer, everything you see is a nail. But I still think that is one metaphor that's worth sort of keeping in mind as a clinician. I think when we say in books, you mentioned a couple of books, but we could name hundreds of books proposed and written by some of our friends, some people we deeply admire. It could be something like Explain Pain, could be Louis Gifford's books. It's there almost contained in everything that's published on pain and self-help guides. We've got a methodology, we've got a particular technique, but I think it's most evident recently with the pain reprocessing therapy community. Because one of the things, when you read those books, I mean, for example, they talk about predictive processing, of which, hopefully that was relevant, what we said earlier, being involved in that huge amounts of understanding, empathy for that perspective. As I said, though, largely wanted to move away from a sort of a pain-bound, neurocentric viewpoint. What I see in a lot of those books, or the couple of books that certainly are available, which I have right next to me as we talk, as well as some of the other books that we're aiming comments at, that they have a very brain-bound viewpoint. I haven't done it, but I will sit down because I've got that type of personality and count how many times the word brain is mentioned in both books, just as I could do that also for Explain Pain. And I've written on that, why I think that this idea that pain is in your brain, and your brains give you pain and your brain concludes things. I've got a couple of quotes directly, but the brain decided, the brain creates, the brain has a power, the brain has power over us. All these ideas, I think, are, for me, a misreading of predictive processing on one level. They're what's known as neurological fallacies in terms of the philosophical breakdown of that. And that also positions me in total agreement with some of my own critiques on social media. I might perhaps suggestively say, I was looking at that work 15 to 20 years before other people started to sort of have the same concerns. But I'm glad that they have those concerns from a different point, and it takes them on a different pathway, which is cool. But I think, that over reliance on the brain, and therefore that is the only sole place that you need to treat people. And I think there's some inherent messages. I've rehearsed this lots of times before, that, if you believe that your brain gives you pain, and you believe that the pain has then the brain has power over you, then what can you do to ever impact your own experience of pain? Because the thing that gives you pain under that treatise is your brain,
Yeah.
and you believe your brain has power over you. You know, you
Yeah.
see it in language all the time with the brain,
Yeah. Yeah.
my brain or your brain. The brain does this. The brain decides, etc. But that's actually a powerful argument against actually some of the central tenets of what people, and particularly pain reprocessing therapies, um, are then trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Much of which we would totally agree with, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you know, the kind of the techniques that they offer. There's one I was reading about, which is sort of using imagery as an assessment. And I mean, I've been doing that for 20 years, and it's a great tool. I would encourage, and when I work with clinicians, when I talk about this stuff, because when you imagine it, you usually have some experience which indicates the kinds of thinking someone may have, some of the beliefs they may have, you know, what's going on in the body. So it kind of works at that sort of pre-action level because the action is sort of stemming from that. So it kind of makes sense. It's fairly simple, but and then can be used. You know, athletes use motor imagery all the time. So it's something that we all use it. We're all sort of rehearsing things in different ways. So it's a very accessible tool. It's not necessary to claim it as a thing that my approach. It's just a thing that's available, and used in the right way at the right time can be really, really valuable. So I agree with a
Yeah.
lot of those things.
And I suppose the thing is that people feel a need to sort of, as you said earlier, you know, they have a rationale, and then they develop a protocol from it, and you follow the protocol, and that's easy to learn, and that's easy actually to teach. And you know, again, I know a lot of people learning some of these more modern based approach, not just pain reprocessing theory, it don't have any medical qualification at all. I think there has to be concerns with that about screening for people who have serious pathologies, red flags masquerading, you know, musculoskeletal and other types of masquerading conditions, and that's really important. Again, if yeah, we can't substitute a thorough classical, for want of a better term, assessment before anyone should enter into any therapy at all,
Yeah,
you know, of
yeah,
any type,
yeah,
including drug-based therapies, anything. You know,
yeah.
you can't just, um, you know, take potluck, you know, and clairvoyance, to the best of my knowledge, is still not science. So, you know, we've got to be very, I think, disciplined about that, and not to cut anyone out of learning something that might help themselves or other people, but just making them know that what comes with managing someone for pain, that's the topic of our conversation, comes with a huge responsibility. And,
Yeah.
you know, you've got to look at yourself in the face and accept that responsibility. I know, just as an aside, I used to make myself very unpopular with physio students over the years who wanted to work with sports teams. So they volunteered while they were physio. And I used to point out that particularly contact sport like rugby union, you know, someone could have an injury that would mean that they would be concussed and lose the ability to breathe. And would you have the right skill set and the right equipment and the right support to be able to deal with that with a SATD? And if you couldn't, potentially your career comes to an end, either because you are so traumatized from it, or there could be legal proceedings against you, that meant that you shouldn't continue. You know, I actually actively discourage people to do that, not from being a meanie or you know, somehow positioned in a position of power and judging other people, just actually to protect the person from themselves and their own, you know, keenness. And I think we need to apply those similar rules for similar reasons to, you know, people who are not qualified to do a full screen on somebody to identify red flags and
Yeah.
serious pathologies and
Yeah.
alternative diagnosis, you know. And the worry is that, again, many of these uh, books have the title on pain, and then you can find lists. So, for example, in one of the books we're referring to on page 231, there are 86 conditions reframed under neuroplastic changes.
Yeah.
Without really a convincing definition of what neuroplastic means.
Yeah.
It's certainly not the same as I asked the International Association for the Study of Pain recognised nociplastic. Whether you agree that's a good or bad term, it's well defined of what it is, and there's a criteria. Neuroplastic somehow, again, is linked to the process of plasticity in the nervous system at any level. But we know that the other system's plastic. A long time ago gave my mate Lorimer Mosley a hard time about, neuroplasticity featuring heavily in everything he wrote about. And he coined the term bioplastic, so that it acknowledged that other systems are plastic too, being endocrine. All systems are plastic and able to change. Much of plasticity in your nervous system, if you do keep it to that lens, is all about actually stability. It's about not changing. Much of the sort of second to second, minute to minute, even week to week things we observe, if we look out for them, are actually about trying to re-establish homeostasis. You could reframe that as allostasis. Do you understand that process well enough? Again, it's referred to, but there's one lens of it always leading to this neuroplastic change, which is maladaptive, which is damaging, not to, you could see those changes which are part of the process of re-establishing homeostasis, normality. And do you need to interfere with that? I would argue, most bodies know how to get themselves better most of the time. I
think we both agree on that, the fact that tapping into the notion that things are changing all the time anyway, whether there's a specific change from telling yourself over and over that you're safe. I just don't think you can say. You can't say that. The person can certainly feel better. Is there some underpinning change in biology? Maybe, maybe not. But it's always changing anyway, because nothing ever stays the same. That's fundamentally impossible. As you said, it's always trying to come back to some sort of stability, heading towards chaos or entropy, and then coming back to this sort of settlement. And I guess that's, one of the strong suits of PP is that, this sort of this building up of errors, and then take some action or shift your thinking, or both, and then minimizing that error, making better predictions, and on you go, as a sort of a fundamental thing that we're doing in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's very much fundamental to this idea of the embodied predictive processing, which really is on the trajectory of active inference. It's not just changing the way in which you think, feel, and therefore the models that exist within your nervous, and obviously under our case other systems, but also you take actions. You must act on the world. And I think, again, what has emerged from many studies has been really impactful for people who are experiencing persistent pain is that actually action, interaction, movement, but also even thinking about movement, some aspect of being inactive and acting on the world and having greater choices than the ones that, if you like, your experience of pain immediately allow you, are really vital components. And again, there are some of these modern agendas for managing pain, cognitive functional therapy, which has huge overlap with pain reprocessing therapy. It might not always admit that, but it does. It shares a lot in common, and that's to be both camps to be applauded for those elements. But I think that they are much more likely to stress movement and interaction, just in the form of exercise, but actually normal engagement with as much of normal life as you can, and actually reframing what you think might be damaging sort of things to do when we have, for example, back pain. Lifting is the classic one. Is lifting bad for your back? Well, absolutely not. There's no real evidence that lifting is bad for your back. It's unaccustomed lifting that might put you in a position of vulnerability. So therefore, there's a direct answer that emerges from that. If it's unaccustomed lifting, get accustomed to lifting. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
get accustomed to doing these things that potentially we know put you at risk.
Mm.
But obviously in the right place with the right support. It's not just a case of telling someone to go off and lift because that's a good thing. You know,
Yeah.
you've got to
Yeah.
know that there's um, enough knowledge and enough acknowledgement of safety while they're doing that. And that's creative therapy and supportive
Mm.
therapy. But again, it may seem like we're picking only on one, but it is important to say that for me personally, I don't know how you feel about it and love to hear what you think, is that the sort of absence of any real consideration of movement, agency, um, activity enrichment within
Mm.
pain reprocessing therapy is a concern to me. It seems retrospective. It seems back to schools for the brave. You know, it's
Yeah.
more um, type of conditioning, behaviorist sort of perspectives.
Mm.
But I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that a lot of it focuses a bit like, I'm anxious, right? I'll do some breathing and that calms me down. Great, brilliant. Now that's dealing with, something that's been triggered, but it's not dealing with why I was triggered in the first place. So it's not getting to the root cause. It's not going to bring about the sustained change with any intent. That's not to say that some people won't do that and then they'll keep doing that and then just generally feel better. And obviously there's reports of people in the book and beyond, saying that they've adopted these methods, and over time some have got better really quickly within a few weeks, some have got better over more extended periods of time. But there's not. It's kind of, again, this is where PP is a great kind of guide, in a sense that, essentially this notion we're creating all of our experiences of ourselves and the world through the way that we act within and upon it. We're generating that sensory information ourselves, which is what is creating the opportunity to update some of these predictions. So bring that down to a kind of a sort of a hands-on level, if you like. Well, not literally hands-on, but it's kind of going, right, what's this person's life all about right now? What are their needs? And you've got the low-hanging fruit or the immediate needs, which could be, I just need to relax. I need to ease this pain a little bit here. I need to move, so I've been sat for a while. I need a hug with someone. I need a quick chat. I need a drink. I need the loo. Whatever it might be, the sort of the immediate needs. And then you've got the deeper needs, which are much more to do with the long story of their life. I need to be accepted. I need to be loved. I need to address this old wound and trauma. I need some self-respect. All of those things, those deeper patterns which come from way back. Some of which turn into disease or disease, we know that, but not all. So again, that's judicious, that's the clinical judgment as we talked to before. And then once you've got the needs, it's like, right, how can I, with my skills and as a clinician, how can I help this person meet their needs in a personalized way? Not a protocol, do it like this. No, let's work through it together. Hence why I always brought the coaching in, the know-how. How do I put this into my world? The person, that is, because that's where the difference has to be made. So the other day I was working with someone, and I always ask them what's most important to them today. What would you like to work on? And this person said, do you know what I really want to work on today? Tying my shoelaces. She was diagnosed with CRPS of her hand. It wasn't CRPS according to the criteria, but anyway, that's so we looked at that and we did the imagery stuff. So right, tell me when you think about doing it, what's that like? And there was tension and fear and worries and all the rest of it. So we acknowledged that. We said yes, of course, because that's your lived world, that's your story world. So your systems are responding to that, and that's completely normal because that's what they're responding to. So, okay, how can we work with this? So we worked in various ways. And what we discovered was it wasn't tying shoelaces per se. It was the bit where you do that and tighten it. That was the sticky bit. So we just looked at some ways of doing that in different, but knowing that this is how it is now, but it can change and you're going to work on stuff. So your sense of impermanence, I'm on a journey, rather than, well, this is it, I can't do my shoe up. So we broke it down. I mean, it's basic skill acquisition there. So it's kind of drawing on all these fields, it's drawing on function, it's really meeting the person where they are. And then she was really pleased with that. She felt great. And then, how do you feel? Oh, I feel really good. Where do you feel that? I feel it here. So there's parts of your body that feel great, yeah? Yeah. So now you're through the reflection, and that's kind of the motivation interviewing side and the reflections. You bring that element in to be able to get the person to really experience richly this success. And that's what changed her pain. Because what I realized years ago was that, so many people are waiting for their pain to get better or to change to start living. But they're just wait and wait and wait and wait. And I thought, you know what, if we turn that round, how about you start living to change your pain? Because it comes in that direction, because you're meeting your needs, you're working towards your goals.
Yeah, and I think that deeper, there's some deeper constructs. I know we haven't made this, and rightly so, about predictive processing or active inference, as we, may prefer the term these days. Although obviously we called it embodied predictive processing, we might change that if we wrote it now, but it doesn't matter. But the point is, deeply ingrained within that is this idea that you do model your world. So if your model is one of fear, you know, fear avoidance, risk, um, avoidance of activities, then obviously that strengthens the model that tells you all of those things are potentially dangerous, and it's more likely to be realized as giving you an experience which is negative. So again, breaking it down the way that you describe it, get into the sort of essence, but then obviously demonstrating that, albeit in a safe environment, you could say, to begin with. But there's nothing wrong with that, making people realize that, making people realize you realize that as a clinician, and you
Yeah.
acknowledge it and empower that acknowledgement. But slowly the system can and will change. And what we're talking about, I'm sure people who are proponents of many different ideas around treating people say, well, we do that. We do that. What are these two Muppets talking about? We absolutely do that. And we're the first to credit it. We're
Yeah.
crediting it. For anyone listening, we are
Yeah.
crediting that you
Yeah.
do that. It's what you call it might not be important. But back to your point about, have you got the flexibility to work away from it? You know, but also understanding, if you want to say this therapy is underpinned by this principle, it's not whether or not I think that you're using the principle well. That it's partly that, but could you use the principle better, is the way that I would say.
Mm.
If you have a more full understanding and you're not, for example, just brain centric, and you think in a wider context, what else could you add to that therapeutic encounter? And none of us, which again I think is something that people are stressing, is it should be reliant on the therapist. I mean, we absolutely are not wanting to
Mm.
people to become reliant on any therapist, right? Just that they are in the initial stages of moving forward and regaining agency and interacting with the world in a much more positive way. That does need, for most people, particularly who've had a long-term experience of pain, um, a bit of support and help. And we should have the skills to do that.
Yeah.
But I think that, yeah, if you think you are a self-evidencing system, according to someone like Jacob Huey's work, what does that look like? That means that, what you're doing in your day-to-day life, how you're perceiving your day-to-day life, how you're interacting in your day-to-day life is self-evidencing. And it
Mm.
can sound quite cruel, but it's not intention to do that. It's a way of realizing that facilitates methods to change and
Yeah.
strategies to change that shouldn't be regimented, shouldn't be routine, should be individualized, should be personalized,
Yeah.
and should be graded, if you like, in terms of exposure. Old-fashioned term. I know a lot of people are no longer comfortable with, whether you are or not, but part of training to become fitter is to use the principles that we know help you to do that. You
Mm.
almost go into an overload principle, depending on whether you're aerobic or anaerobic, what sort of metabolism you use. We're comfortable with that. And this
Mm.
is go back to your coaching. I think a lot of really high quality coaches, and I know you've worked and engaged with them to try and extract that information. But I bet you if we put some of our patients, i.e., people, in front of them, they do a bloody good job based
Yeah.
on the principles of what they,
Yeah.
what they've learned and how they've developed. But they could also run the risk by not understanding enough about certain aspects of people's experience, and certain aspects of pathology, because we're not belittling pathology here.
No.
But nor, I'm going to take the opportunity to say that there isn't and should not be a pain Olympics. We've got almost infighting amongst the pain community of whose pain's worse, what type of pain trumps other people's pain. It's a vastly judgmental thing, and actually, whilst it's occurring between patient communities, it's fostered by actually the power base of medical communities, that don't think they're encouraging it, but are encouraging it with various messaging. Neuropathic pain is worse than non-neuropathic pain. And neuroplastic is in some people's handling is the very worst type of pain you can have, but in other people's handling it's the most amenable to treating if you read certain text. So in fact it probably is, but do these things really exist? I always love your post that pretty much determine they exist at a particular level, but how relevant are they? And what and how is that contributing to this self-evidencing of being you in your world, in your lived world, and I think it's just a complex thing. Again, go back to that, and always say to people, how difficult's your job? And you've heard me say that, but I would say that to patients, your job is partly to walk in the same direction as me and find the right strategies. That's bloody difficult for both of us, because some days something will work and then the next day it doesn't work. So you've got to be prepared to change and be flexible and be imaginative, and that's all on them as much as it is on you. And that's not in any way loading people with these expectations, we say, which could lead to a sense of failure if they don't meet those expectations. That's the concerning thing. We all are not good at things we're supposed to be good at doing on certain days. Take the World Cup we've just watched. If you're into football, there are people who weren't good in those games who are world-class footballers. In fact, they were shocking. Does it make them bad? Everyone's heard, the old, sort of performance is temporary, but class is permanent. We just need to realise that we don't need to be hard on ourselves, and I'm talking, from a position of being a human being now, not as a clinician or as a patient. You've heard me say, perhaps some people are shocked when I followed patients at a conference who describe themselves as patients, describe their experiences in a very eloquent and hugely sort of makes you hugely respect them because they've opened up. But then they start talking about and identifying themselves as a patient, not as a person, as a human being. That always for me is something that I sort of try and gently push against, to say, look, you're a human being first and foremost. These labels are important in certain situations, but they're not in others.
I mean, the intent of all these messages is true and right and so on and so forth. They just land in different ways for people, and I get it, and I have great compassion for that. People that resist some of the stuff we're saying, the stuff that pain reprocessing therapy says. That rigid belief that no, my pain is real, my pain is structural. Validating those words. Yes, I hear you. It's a Ram Dass's. I hear you. But we're trying to help people to just jostle those beliefs just a little to begin with, just gently, so they can see as soon as you take a different perspective, things can start to change. And I guess we're sort of coming to the end of our well, this particular conversation. There's a lot more we can say. Maybe we'll come back and do some other parts, but it just really strikes of hope. I think, the fact that, the thinking is always evolving. There's lots of great work being done. There's some really useful things in those books that we've nodded to. There's some concerns that we've nodded to, and that's all part of the debate moving forward. We're not there yet. And in our lifetime we won't be there, but we're striving and we're working on it. And ultimately a lot of people doing amazing work, and that's all to be applauded. But the more we can come together and have these discussions, not these sorts of discussions, just debate together and raise concerns and get the questions and the dialogue, that's only going to benefit everyone.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I mean, that's hopefully what you've attempted to do, what I've attempted to do, but lots and lots of other people who are not on this podcast and don't appear on podcasts do all the time, and there's a huge community who are motivated to do the very best for each other and with each other, and that both clinicians and people with pain and experiencing pain. And that's been one of the great things that's emerged over the last 10 years, is this voice that has always needed to be listened to, but we could do more. But it is more and more, people, patient, whatever label in a particular framework people are giving, but who are first person experiences of this thing, persistent pain and acute pain, and giving their voice and that being listened to. And we have to also make mention of drug companies get a bad name, but they're trying to develop compounds that could be helpful and useful. It's easy to position them in a negative light. History has probably told us that most compounds are only effective for certain people in certain situations at certain points in their sort of pain journey, pain experience. So we have to be mindful of that, and it takes an awful long time. If we keep identifying a target to develop a drug for each of those, is probably we're not going to have analgesic coverage with drugs for the next probably 100,000 years, if we, but maybe technology is a way of speeding that up. But again, I've enjoyed several conversations recently with Dr. Abby Tabor, who is fortunate enough, she decided to do a PhD with myself and Prof Lorimer Mosley, and she's doing some wonderful stuff around mattering. And we've also played idea about anti-mattering, how much do you matter in the world you find yourself in, and what pain does in terms of sort of probably pushing you into anti-mattering. But there are all sorts of things that might emerge from that, which we can bring it to the table. And I could float loads of names, and apologies to people who we haven't mentioned on this podcast, both who have influenced my thinking, your thinking, and other people's thinking. There's a big community who are trying to do better, and that's hugely encouraging. And hopefully what we've not done today is just set about trying to mug people or mug an approach, or tell people not to invest in a book or whatever. But we maybe focused on one approach, but there are other approaches we could have focused on where, criticism would be warranted, but also the same statement that there's so much overlap with what we're all trying to do. But could we do better? Could we nuance it more? Could a better understanding of some of these modern theories of pain, obviously one of which I'm a proponent of, which you don't have to try to understand if you don't want to. There are other alternatives, probably positing the same thing ultimately. But we just need to do better and strive to do better, but also acknowledge, we're doing a good job, and be kind to ourselves and kind to each other.
Yeah. No, definitely. That's great. Always brilliant chatting. Love it.
Love it.
It'd be great to do some more. But that's fantastic. Thanks, Mick.
No worries, Rich. We can whenever you want.
Take it easy.
All right. Take care, mate.